Hey internets. When it comes to logical fallacies and critical thinking and the discussions about them, I occasionally see people going over what they think the worst fallacy or erroneous bias is. And it's actually one that most people haven't really heard of and doesn't really get much discussion. The reason why this comes down to how you define what the worst fallacy could be. Is it the stupidest and silliest fallacy, or the most dangerous fallacy in the sense that people tend to fall for it the most, even at high levels of general cognitive ability? If it's the stupidest and silliest fallacy, then perhaps personal incredulity wins to prize. I can't understand this argument, therefore it is wrong, is pretty high up there on the why they still monkey do scale. And in terms of bias, probably the stupidest one is the framing effect. The guy saying 1 + 1 = 3 is more attractive than the guy saying 1 + 1 = 2, therefore 1 + 1 = 3. That one's definitely pretty high up there too. But I would argue that the prize should actually go to the most dangerous of them. This is actually why on my channel I focus a lot on refuting midwittery rather than refuting the low-hanging fruit of dimwittery. Because midwittery actually is able to have power over how our society is shaped. So I would argue that the worst error in reasoning is actually a cognitive bias that I like to call first-order bias, which is this unfortunate tendency to place an irrational amount of importance on the immediate and obvious effects of an event, action, or decision, which are known as first-order effects, or in some cases just be completely blind to secondary effects and beyond altogether. And the reason this is so dangerous is because just about everybody is guilty of it to some degree. The bureaucratic world that we live in is genuinely pretty darn complex, and so who's actually at fault for certain bad decisions that led to certain bad outcomes? Sometimes they can be multiple orders of effects down the line or previously in some other line. It can sometimes genuinely require a lot of detective work to really understand who or what is at fault for a problem, because it's not always what's right in front of your face. And of course, the most common issue we see this in is economics and people not understanding incentives. Like, for example, the entire rise of breadtube and socialism almost entirely comes from people not understanding how incentives work in the order of events. In fact, not just socialists, just kind of economic illiteracy in general is where you'll find a lot of first-order bias, with the most common issue you can kind of bring up being rent control. When you look at the voter cattle, you'll find that they consistently see rent control as a very popular policy, despite the fact that just about any economist with an IQ higher than a turnip will tell you that it's a terrible idea. Because when you enact rent control, when you put a cap on rental prices for the housing market, that has a second-order effect of disincentivizing the creation of new housing, which has even more further effects down the line. Like, for example, it can result in a buyer's market because it becomes not worth it in the city to rent properties out, and instead it actually becomes a better economic decision to just sell houses if you can. Which then ironically actually ends up hurting the working poor because they have less housing availability in the city. A few people might immediately benefit from the rent control, but of course as soon as even those people who do benefit try to move, they get screwed, and of course everybody else gets screwed. TLDR, it's considered a terrible policy because it has a bunch of unintended consequences. And of course, when the state is asked to enact it, they are notoriously incompetent about it. But the thing is, people don't care. Thanks to the first-order bias issue, people don't think about those second, third, and fourth-order effects. They're only thinking to themselves, oh, my rent is high, my landlord is asking for this rent, therefore my landlord bad, government help. The state needs to jump in and make it illegal for the price to go above this random arbitrary line. And it doesn't work. But the vooters keep voting for it anyways, because they're stuck so hard in the first order bias brain rot that they don't see beyond those effects. They just look at the negative effects that high rent has on the immediate obvious consequence on their pocketbook without really considering much of anything else. And that by itself is pretty bad. But the problem is that when you really start to get down to it and look into first order bias and just how common it is and how irrational voters are about it, you'll see it goes far beyond just basic economic illiteracy. Like this example I saw on X recently. American citizens can't even get free healthcare, and you all think undocumented immigrants do? That Kool-Aid must be bangin'. Which of course is ridiculous, because just because there's no specific, easy, simple to understand law that gives them free healthcare, that doesn't mean that there aren't any effects beyond first order that some events, actions, or decisions actually do result in various immigrants and the undocumented being able to get free healthcare. Or really, technically anybody who doesn't care about their credit. Because what happens is that anybody can technically get free healthcare in the United States as an effect of laws that generally require all hospitals to provide urgent care to everybody without upfront cost. And so of course what people can do is you can just go to the ER when you're sick, even if it's not really for a serious emergency issue, but just get some kind of treatment, or at least rule out serious illness and get admitted if it is something serious. And then when the bill comes later, so people can just kind of skip wipe out on the bill if they want to, which ordinarily is a bad idea as it will just absolutely ruin your credit. So if you're a responsible citizen, it's not a good idea to get free healthcare by doing this, because it's not really free healthcare. You're actually just stealing it. And again, this can hurt your credit to the point where you'll need to file for bankruptcy. However, the issue here is that with someone who's undocumented, there's actually a pretty big loophole here, because who are they? How are you going to get them to pay? How are you going to hurt their credit? Especially in the extreme cases where someone who they have no idea who they are just comes into the country, steals from hospitals by exploiting these loopholes, and then just leaves. They just ghost out of the system. And to make things worse, some states like California will just have the taxpayer through Medicaid or their Medi-Cal program end up footing the bill. And yet lots of people don't understand this. They don't think about things beyond the first order because there isn't an obvious sign being posted at the hospital that says undocumented immigrants can get free healthcare here on taxpayer dime. Because that obvious sign doesn't exist, they just assume that it's not a thing. And that is the dangers of first order bias. It's absolutely astounding when you realize how many people are unable to comprehend how various dynamics work beyond the first order. The implications this has in regards to democracy are actually really quite severe. Because there's no specific, easy to understand the undocumented get free healthcare rule, people who lack reasoning skills will argue that the effect doesn't exist. Let that sink in for a moment. There is a large portion of the population who mostly all have the right to vote, with their vote counting just as much as yours, who almost completely lack the cognitive capacity to see through A causing B causing C. The second you go beyond B, that's too much for them. If it's not a directly obvious first order A to B immediate effect in their face, the effect doesn't exist. They are completely blind to C. C does not exist because it requires too much thought. C is not happening. And if C is happening, perhaps it's a good thing, because of course being blind to C means they are often also blind to the problems caused by C. C causing D, causing E, third, fourth, fifth, sixth order effects even further down the line. Those effects are just so outside of their scope of reasoning that those effects might as well just be voodoo magic to their minds. And then again, you can even push it further. Remember how bureaucratic our institutions have gotten and how interdependent they are on the state and its thousands of laws and rules and regulations. We are looking at a system with effects spiraling into each other at the 5th, 10th, or even 500th order effect. Suddenly, it all becomes clear. It's no wonder why corporate media is able to sell such lies. The vast majority truly have no clue what's going on, including even those of us who are smart enough to understand the problem of first order bias. Because it's so complex that it's almost impossible for anybody to truly understand really what's going on. And so most of the voter cattle really has no idea what's happening, how it's happening, or where we are going. And so the media is able to step in and provide these comprehensive theories of reality that are easy to digest and understand, but just completely wrong. But because they're digestible, they become a hot commodity. Comforting lies for the masses to take in so that they can get on with their day without worrying about the fact that they truly have no idea who or what is pulling the strings in our world. And then the brainwashed trash libs go to vote, basing their decisions entirely on a combination of the lies they have been fed and whatever fantastical, irrational whims of the moment happen to cross their minds in the voting booth. And then you have to remember, the cherry on top of it all is that the midwits who have infested these institutions have even come up with an entire ideology to justify their own ignorance. Through the magic of radical postmodernist thought, also known as presuppositional apologetics for secular people, their lack of ability to comprehend the multiple layers of these effects is rationalized away by deducing that objective reality must not exist. It's actually impressive. The devil himself could not have devised a more effective system for guaranteeing we spiral into idiocracy in such a way that people can easily notice but not so easily understand how or why it is happening. That right there is the main implication of the sad prevalence of first order bias. It is a massive democracy black pill when you realize that the voter cattle, through a combination of their own ignorance and the corruption of legacy media and corrupt politicians working together to ensure they remain ignorant, are allowing this cognitive bias to trick them into consistently voting against any real solution. And that is why I say first order bias is the most dangerous cognitive error. It's not necessarily the stupidest. In fact, it's very easy to commit this error, but it's definitely the worst of the worst. Anyways, that's all I have to say, just another quick rant. Thanks for watching. Remember to like, share, comment, and definitely subscribe if you haven't subscribed already, because I've got a pretty big video on a subject a lot of people have asked me to cover, and I've been wanting to cover for a while, that I'll be able to likely finish within the next week or so. But for now, that is all. Thanks again for watching. Till next time.